Good evening and welcome to News Review. The trial of a man charged with child rape was set down for April this week at the Supreme Court. Kevin Norman Whitfield was charged with rape, attempted rape and assault of a child under the age of 13. Mr. Whitfield pleaded not guilty to all of the charges, which date back to March and October 1999. The trial begins at the Supreme Court on the 13th of April. Two local men have received lengthy prison sentences for drug charges in unrelated cases. Ernest Alger of number 5 Schomburg was sentenced to 7 years, 8 months in prison for possession with intent to supply over 60 grams of cocaine. Alger pleaded guilty to 2 charges of possession and intent to supply of cocaine last October, for which he was sentenced to 4 years. While on police bail, the 46-year-old committed 3 further offences and was sentenced for possession and intent to supply cocaine and assaulting a police officer. And another local man was sentenced to over 3.5 years in prison. Wesley Phillips pleaded guilty to possession with intent to supply and importation of over 50 grams of cocaine earlier in the month. A Spanish national arrested on a European arrest warrant was ordered to be extradited this week at the magistrates' court. Borja Polvillo Martín is wanted for absconding the jurisdiction while serving time for a robbery he committed in the Campo area in 2005. On his third court appearance locally this week, he surrendered himself.
Borja Polvillo Martín was sentenced in the Spanish courts to 9 years in prison for robbery and possession of a firearm during an incident which occurred in 2005. 3 years later, in November 2008, he was given a weekend release and never returned. The 32-year-old resident of Constitution House, Glacis Estate, has been remanded in custody since his arrest last Saturday. During his first 2 court appearances, he said he would refuse to surrender and return to Spain, preferring the matter to be dealt with in Gibraltar. However, today he surrendered and will now be extradited within the next 10 days. It has been a stressful time for his family, with his wife giving birth today on the date of his final court appearance in Gibraltar. Borja Polvillo Martín will be returning to Spain, where it will be up to the Spanish courts to decide his fate.
More than a year ago, UEFA told the Gibraltar Football Association that a 5,000-seater stadium could be eligible for Category 4 status and would therefore be able to host international matches. That's according to the opposition, which said the government was made aware of this earlier this year. The GSD is now calling on the GSOP Liberals to come clean on where they stand on the Europa Point Stadium before a general election is called.
We have very credible sources that tell us that UEFA informed, and there's a communication between UEFA and the GFA informing the GFA that 8,500-seater stadium was not necessary and that a 5,000-seater stadium would have sufficed. And indeed, that is within UEFA practice already, because there are a number of countries such as San Marino, Andorra and other countries that have stadiums that are around about the 5,000 mark or indeed less. So it's not surprising. We've also been told, again from very reliable sources, that the government have known about this from earlier on this year. So it's not the UEFA, the GFA have known about this for a number of years now, and the government have known about this earlier on this year. Now, I think that that is a matter that must be brought into the public domain because it affects very directly the debate in relation to the location of the stadium. Because, look, if you can build a Category 4 stadium with a capacity of 5,000, Victoria Stadium would suffice without indeed having to relocate the Cepsa petrol station. So it's very relevant to alternatives to Europa Point.
And the Gibraltar Football Association is awaiting a report from UEFA after it carried out a full technical assessment of Victoria Stadium. It's also been reconsidering its stance on the required size and capacity of any future national football stadium in Gibraltar.
As much of what Mr. Feetham says, it's all based on speculation and not revealing sources, not telling us who his experts are that advise of all the dangers of LNG that the government's experts don't advise on, and all the other information that Mr. Feetham wants to put out in the public domain without making himself responsible for the source of his information. What the government has done, and it has done it in partnership with the GFA, is to assess the level of concern there has been in the community about the initial proposals for Europa, and try and see whether those concerns can be taken on board, whether there can be mitigation of the plans proposed. And the GFA in particular has been pursuing that with UEFA. There has been huge controversy in the newspaper pages in Gibraltar with different people who understand football writing about the UEFA statutes and what they mean, and the GFA putting different positions. But look, the GFA is in contact with UEFA, and its communications with UEFA are what they convey to us. To date, there has been no change in the UEFA requirements, but it is true to say that the GFA, encouraged by the government of Gibraltar, and by me in particular, are taking into consideration the concerns of the public, which means trying to reduce the size of the stadium, ergo trying to reduce the number of people who would be seated in such a stadium, and in that way perhaps mitigate the effect of the stadium on Europa Point.
The leader of the Basque group in the Spanish parliament had to get out of his car and walk into Gibraltar on Monday because of the length of the frontier queue. Aitor Esteban of the Partido Nacionalista Vasco was paying a courtesy call on the government after the chief minister met him and representatives of most Spanish political parties in Madrid last year.
Well, the reason was to answer to the kind invitation by Mr. Picardo to come here, but I was really very interested because there is a lot of talk in the Spanish Parliament about Gibraltar, and you cannot talk properly, you don't really know the situation directly. So I wanted to come here, walk in the streets, talk to people, and feel the real situation. In what form? To try to find solutions for the real problems that the citizens bear every day.
You've only been here a short while, of course, but what are your first impressions?
Well, my first impression was the queue in the border, a very long one, almost 1 kilometer, and I have to walk to cross it. I think it has to be a real problem for many people who every day have to cross to work. But a peaceful town, peaceful place with, how to say, the differences. I think that the differences and the variety of people, religion, languages is the main characteristic of Gibraltar, and I think that's a value that should be kept.
The issue for us really is about extending an invitation for people to come to Gibraltar to see the reality of Gibraltar. And too often people are told things about Gibraltar which, as we know, are not true. Too often the Spain that we see is the Spain that is making statements about Gibraltar that we know are untrue, and therefore we know are seeking to persuade people of something which is not the reality of Gibraltar. But what I found when I went to Madrid last year was a lot of people outside of the Partido Popular and outside of UPyD who have very open minds, who want to see Gibraltar, who want to make up their own modern minds about what their position should be about Gibraltar, without regard to the much more medieval approach that we see sometimes displayed by the current Spanish administration.
Works on the Spanish side of the frontier affecting passengers and vehicles are expected to be completed by the end of June this year. The European Commission assured Gibraltar MEP Julie Girling that the lengthy border delays of recent years will become a thing of the past, following the reconstruction of the vehicle and passenger crossing point between Gibraltar and Spain. The statement followed a question by Mrs. Girling asking whether the Spanish government has agreed to finalise the works by the Commission's deadline of this summer, or whether there's a more specific target date. The answer provided referred to information issued by the Spanish authorities that works most relevant for passenger and vehicle flows is estimated to be finalized at the end of June 2015. Mrs. Girling, although delighted with the news, assured she would continue to monitor the situation and apply further pressure to the Commission if required. And we'll be back with more of this week's news after this break.